Sweet, Matt. So excited to have this chat with you, especially because as I reflect on the whole like podcasting experience, it's interesting. A lot of people that are already like quote unquote successful will be willing to have conversations with me, which is like super cool. But it's interesting because when I have conversations with them, it's a very different story that they tell when they have already achieved some success in their own rights of like having long storied careers and being in a very comfortable financial situation. But it's a very different conversation that I have with other people who are either early on in their careers or somewhere in the middle and are kind of taking a bet on themselves to some extent and to like follow their path in real time. And we met on Twitter, had a couple of great conversations, and thought it would be fun to just like document where you're currently at, understand like what you're working on and excited about, and also the challenges. So one, appreciate you joining for the conversation, and two, would love for you maybe to just give the audience kind of a level set on like what you're currently working on and why you decided to kind of partake in this endeavor. So would love to hear a little bit of context there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, dude, thank you so much for having me on. I know we connected on, you were one of the first people I connected with on Twitter back when I started writing online a couple months ago. And I just like appreciative of our friendship and being able to chat. So yeah, what I'm working on, I am building like a creative content agency right now, North End Creative, and working with, I mean, there's a wide range of clients right now, but anyone from B2B, crypto SaaS, in-person wellness studio up here in Venice in California where I'm living. But my kind of thesis over the last couple of years with regard to narrative and story has always been that everyone knows they need to talk about what they're doing and more specifically why they're doing it. Now that can look different in terms of where you are in your business life cycle, right? Are you sprinting towards a fundraising round? Do you need people in seats for sales calls? Or you need to recruit talent? Whatever your like the mix of your business needs are, narrative is always a part of that equation. Now the question is, how do you not just tell the right story, but distribute it in the right way at the right time to the right person in such a way that it gets people to do what you need them to do? And I've been in the agency world in the past and worked with agencies and a lot of great ones. One of the things I've seen is sometimes people are in danger of selling just tactics and not the strategy as well. It's like, hey, we'll write, especially content, writers, and my background is in writing. It's like, hey, we'll write, Y post for you for X dollars, and that can be great, and that is totally good. But if you can come to a business or a founder or a CEO and be like, okay, let me understand your business from first principles, where you need to get in 6 to 9 months or wherever your time frame is, work backwards from there, and then figure out a content strategy and tactics to get you there. That is very fun, and it's a huge value add to businesses. So I've done that in some way, shape, or form, either in the agency world prior or at in full-time roles. But I left my job in December of 2023 and started doing that full-time for companies. So
awesome. And at this point, is North End Creative, is that a solo endeavor on your part? Are you running this operation by yourself, or do you have other people involved as well?
Yeah, it's a solo operation. I guess it's just me, kind of like on my own payroll. Yep. I've connected with a couple, great subcontractors, who help me with video stuff and, to augment my skill set, which is a lot in like writing, sales, and ops and that kind of stuff. And it's also been great I have written a lot more online recently and just meeting people who are doing similar things. Right, people understand narrative. A lot of people understand narrative production and storytelling and why it's important. Mm-hmm. But I met a ton of cool people who are doing similar things in different verticals or with different sorts of ICPs, ideal customer profiles, and just being able to become friends with them and be like, hey, like I'm working on this thing, you're doing this thing, we're doing some similar things. How can we horse trade, or how can we work together, or how can we learn from each other? Has been fantastic.
And why the even urge or desire to get into this? So you mentioned like quitting your job in December. It's been a few months now. Mm-hmm. Like in the lead up to that, thinking through the interest, the opportunity, like why even make the jump from the get-go?
Yeah, man, absolutely. That's a good question, and I wrestled with that for a while. I loved where I worked prior. I worked at a company called Eco, and they were so good to me. Like the founding team there is fantastic. I learned so much from managers and coworkers that I'd had for those 2+ years I was there. Um, but over the last couple of months, when I was at the company, we'd gone through a couple of rounds of reduction in forces, and teammates had moved on and stuff like that. And I just kind of zoomed all the way out, and I was like, okay, what do I want from my career at this point in time? Do I feel like I'm growing? If so, how? If not, why? So I spent a lot of time thinking and just talking to old mentors and friends, and I realized that I really did want to take something truly from 0 to 1 myself. I had learned a ton about growth and ops and product. My role there had spanned at one point. It was like the whole funnel, right? From like lead gen, top of funnel stuff to like mid funnel content production, content strategy, to like getting on sales calls and closing people and onboarding them into the app, and then nurturing them afterwards for customer support and stuff. So I'd had a wide range of experiences across kind of growth, GTM, and ops. And I knew deep down, I was like, okay, I'm 24. I can either stay or I can take a bet. And at that point, I was like, okay, what do I have to lose, right? Like I don't have much to lose. At that point, I was like, if for some reason the business doesn't work or doesn't fail or I can't get one single client or whatever, worst case, let's say I can't pay my rent. Like I'm talking worst
Yep.
case. Like, okay, my parents are in town. I crash their couch for like 4 or 5 months, apply to jobs or whatever, back on my feet soon, right? So I kind of just war gamed out to myself the worst possible scenarios in my mind, assuming I stay healthy and stuff like that. And I was like, okay, if that's the worst that can happen, right, you should bet on yourself. And I've always loved building things and creating things. And I had to answer the other part of your question about what opportunity. I have worked like in content and GTM and kind of in those roles prior. And there's a big need for, especially with very technical products, for someone to be able to explain and synthesize what this thing actually is and how it works itself out in the lives of consumers in a way that is easy to grasp and understand. It's very hard to do, and I had a lot of practice doing that with Eco, and I had worked at an agency prior, and I love doing it. Like there's a synthesis element, there's a creation element, and you can really help people distribute that message about their product in a way that grows their business. So that's kind of the answer.
And in terms of like the actual product or service that you're providing to like some of these exciting startups, what would the ideal, I guess, like nature of the collaboration look like? I imagine it varies based on the company and their needs.
Yeah.
But if you're like a Series A startup or a seed stage startup and you have a product, but you don't have a lot of resources to invest in like marketing or go-to-market launch materials, I guess like is that primarily what you're focused on, or does it run the gamut in terms of what you're willing to take on?
It's a good question. I mean, right now I'm willing to take on a lot of different types of clients. I think the most successful engagements are seed to Series A, give or take. Like you have product market fit or some semblance thereof. So you've either raised a seed round or you're driving towards Series A. So there's capital there, but you're not at the point where you want to hire a full-time head of content or a full-time content marketer, right? Because you got to find the person, you got to make sure they're a good culture fit, you got to onboard them, you got to do insurance, you got to like all this the hassle that comes with hiring a full-time employee.
Yeah.
If you're like, hey, we're like a B2B company, we need to get like case studies out, we need to do a whole like how-to series, blog suite. Our founders need to be talking about what we're doing on LinkedIn and Twitter. And a lot of founders they have such deep wells of subject matter expertise, but either they don't really like to write, they're not that good at it, it's not their skill set, or they're just like, I don't really want to do it, right? It's one of those things that kind of just push to the side. And if you can come along and say like, hey, not only can I embed into your team, basically understand your product, understand your service, your market, and what will get them to move, but then we can deliver all these different things. Whatever the highest leverage thing is for you, we can deliver it quickly. It'll be done well. People are like, yeah, they're really amenable to that. So but to answer your question, it varies based on the client, right? So I worked with clients before who are like, they figure out that one of the best ways for them to generate leads is to go through VC partners and be like, hey, we're going to create collateral and resources that our VC partners can give to other portfolio companies as a way to be like, hey, check this thing out, right? You have this problem around whatever it is. This other company created this like comprehensive playbook and guide. Read this, and then if you need help, like go talk to them. So there's not just like tactical like writing blogs element. It's more than that. It's like, okay, what is the highest leverage, quickest way for you to develop or to earn the trust of your end user, and then go do that. Put out content that gets you there. So, yeah,
makes a lot of sense. In terms of the like expectations versus reality of like, I mean, I guess you're 3 months in right now, and I imagine that you had a couple of like hypotheses, or at least like a thesis or a framework for how you go about like generating leads, interacting with people, like figuring out what the opportunity or the market is for like what you're trying to offer. Like just curious in terms of like positive signals and like challenging signals that you've experienced so far. Like if you were to summarize the first few months in this kind of journey.
Yeah, it's a good question. Positive, negative signals in terms of lead generation. I mean, in terms of lead generation, when you're starting out, everything is down. Everything good in business is just downstream of having homies, which sounds like kind of cliche. But I knew prior to launching, I was like, I just need to make friends with people online who are like, either they like are working on something that I can help, they know somebody. So that was like my P0, kind of, if you will, of like to get leads. And I had avoided that for a long time in my career. Like, you know, I love writing, and I like it's kind of like my bread and butter, what I love to do. But I was like, oh, maybe no one will care what I post. No one, you know, whatever. Like all the stories in your head that you tell yourself. And I literally give myself accountability. I literally bought. Actually, I have it here. This like little, you know, like the at a glance things you'd have in school.
Yeah, sure.
Like the little agendas, and you buy from Staples or something before the school year. I just bought one for like $3, and I would mark off every day that I like posted something online. So I just like X the date, right? Which is like, I don't know, it sounds kind of dumb, but it was a forcing function to me. Like every day I'm like, did I, I've replied to somebody, or I, tweeted something or messaged someone on LinkedIn or whatever it was, and just like force myself to do that. And in doing so, you meet a ton of people, and you start to have conversations. You're like, hey, like I'm thinking about doing this thing, am I crazy? Like, am I just like out of, because you're like in your head, you're like, okay, this seems like a good idea. There seems to be something here in terms of a business or a service offering, but you don't know what you don't know. So figuring out ways to get in touch with people who either are further along in the journey, or who have some sort of expertise, or who just are smart people building cool things, which is truly the best conversations. And they're like, hey, you should think about this, or talk to this person, or whatever. So a lot of the initial, and I still do that actively. I mean, that's why we're on this call, because we like met on Twitter. Doing that early days was really, really helpful, and begun to validate my hypothesis around narrative production and distribution, in terms of thinking about narrative as a product. And like any product, like table stakes is having a good product. Like it has to solve the pain point of the user and solve it incredibly freaking well. But then you win, I think it's a Peter Thiel thing, but you win on many times on distribution, right? You could have a great story that you can tell to whomever, but if you don't distribute that in the right way, in the right time, to the right people, and all that kind of stuff, then no one's going to care, right? It's not going to actually do anything for your business. And that was kind of my hypothesis. And the more I had calls with people, the more I was actively just stress testing that in real time. Because people would be like, well, what are you building, right? And I'd be like, oh, like I'm thinking about this, right? Like in narrative production and content strategy and blah, blah, blah. And you can tell people are like, oh, yeah, actually, I've been thinking about something similar. Or, oh, yeah, I heard this thing from this guy. You should talk to him. So I wanted to really open source. I guess what I'm trying to say is I wanted to open source as much of my thinking and my hypotheses as possible, so that people could be like, dude, what? This makes no sense. Or like, actually, yeah, but maybe refine it this way, or think about it that way. And that has been like super helpful. And I continue to do that like very actively, to this day. And it's been so huge. And you just meet cool people.
100%. I mean, that is how we met. And it's interesting that we're having like this kind of a conversation now, because for the last 3 to 4 months, I've been on this like marketing and advertising learning sprint where basically I'll just take like 10 to 15 books on a topic that I feel pretty inadequate on, and I'll just like read through those books and try and go from like 0 to 1 as quickly as possible. And like one of the key lessons from that like marketing and learning sprint is that like the best story oftentimes is what wins. It's not always the best product, you know? And it's interesting because there was a quote from Sam Altman at OpenAI, and there was a clip from him, and basically he was saying that it's dangerous for entrepreneurs to try and start a startup that isn't incredibly ambitious, because if it's not incredibly ambitious, it's very hard to get people to gravitate towards you and to back you, right? If it's like, hey, I'm Elon Musk and I'm trying to go to Mars, very easy to get behind a mission like that. But if it's, hey, I'm going to create the next, social media company, it's like there's a bunch of those already. There's so many of those are funded by mediocre VCs. And if you actually want to differentiate yourself and attract attention, like you have to do something radical. And it seems like, that is kind of the service that you're offering to some of these companies, is like you need to figure out a way to tell your story in a compelling way that is authentic, but that can like supercharge your prospects and opportunity.
Oh yeah, I mean that taps into like human nature, right? Which I think is anything good in business is really downstream of understanding human nature and human psychology. Like people yearn to be part of something that's bigger than themselves, and we see that all over the world, right? Sports teams, nation states, whatever, companies. It's like I want to feel like I am part of something that is much bigger than religions, right? That is much bigger than myself, and the bigger your swing, the bigger opportunity to build a narrative around that. And that's not to say that e-commerce, D2C, whatever. You still need narrative there, why people would buy your stuff. But I think that's kind of how I got into, I really kind of stumbled my way into the deep tech, hard tech, whatever scene, because I live in Manhattan Beach. El Segundo is right up the road, like literally 3 minutes up the road. The first, me getting on Twitter was actually because I saw Augustus, who's now a friend. He runs Rainmaker, which is a great company. I saw him on Twitter talking about El Segundo, and I was like, wait, the El Segundo that like I grew up right next to? And I just kind of went down that rabbit hole, and I have just learned a ton from those guys. I've met a bunch of them. I was at the hackathon a couple weeks ago. But they are very, very good at building narrative around what they're doing, and it's become a thing. Like the El Segundo just became a thing kind of out of nowhere, and it's been a sleepy SoCal town. I've grown up right next to it. So just to echo what you're saying, the bigger shot you take, the bigger opportunity to really build a compelling story.
In terms of like even the background and experience that you had in like producing content, or even like writing, in like you studied, I think it was at UPenn, you had studied like economics, politics, philosophy, right? What was your experience like there? How did you like start to gain some experience in the content space? Because even if I saw like a market opportunity where, hey, I think that these startups could use help telling their story in a more effective way, and I could provide a service around that, I would feel like incredibly lost just because I have no grounding or background or experience. But I know you do have a little bit. So can you talk a little bit about, prior experiences?
Yeah, absolutely. It's an interesting story. I think it really started in high school. We had, it was AP English 11, and we had an essay on Fight Club, the book The Fight Club, and which is like the book is a good book, but I remember getting the essay back and I got an 100 on it, which was like rare. Our teacher did not give 100s. It was like a decent essay. It was a good grade, but that I remember distinctly getting the essay back and being like, oh, what? And having a conversation with that teacher and her being like, you could like really do something with writing, right? You have like, you found your voice, and most people don't find it until later on, or they don't find it at all. And I remember just thinking like, wow, I would love to get paid to write one day, just because that's how I've always seen and processed the work, like personally, like journals growing up, and that's how I've been able to make sense of the stories of my own. We all live in narrative, right? Like, which is why it's such a fundamental human, the humans are the storytelling animal. It's how we make sense of our own lives. And if you don't have a narrative that you can map, in relation to your own life, that people feel lost, right? Like, where am I doing? What am I going? Or where am I going? What am I doing? So I kind of knew that, and I just naturally was good with words. I was like, I like words. Like, that's how I see the world. Some people see it through numbers. I saw it through words. Yep. So I kind of had that in the back of my mind since like 10th, 11th grade, and went on into college. And I love what I studied. I really didn't know what I wanted to do. There were a couple of years where I was very intense on going to the military. I would have been a totally different life path. But I knew that like I wanted to get a degree that was not I was not a STEM guy. I knew that. I was in anatomy for a year. I like got a D on my first test. I was like, okay, I'm memorizing the ligaments of the bone is just not for me. Like God bless everyone who it's for, but it's not for me. So I was like, I want to do something that's like not just straight econ and not just also philosophical, like some conglomeration. Because my thinking was that like, okay, if you're going to talk about economics, talk about the economy and firms and GDP and all that kind of stuff, macro, micro, eventually you're going to start talking about politics, right? Who makes like the rules of the game, yep, more or less. If you talk about politics, you got to start talking about philosophy, right? Why do we believe what we believe? Epistemic, like stuff like that. So there's all those three things like all made sense to me in my head as three things that like interweave on top of each other. And I was like, well, it would just kind of make sense to study them all. They all are interesting to me. So that's what I did. And but you know, when I was in college, I rode at Penn. So I honestly, looking back, it was a lot of time, right? I had like a morning practice, and I would go to class for a couple hours. I have like an afternoon row, and then weights, and then dinner, and then you study. So there was a world in which maybe I could have taken more classes or different classes or whatever, but I enjoyed rowing. I loved being on a team, and it felt like you were building again, kind of like the builder urge or builder gene. It's like you get together with a small group of people. It's like a startup. It's like a small group of people. You're trying to get to this really hard goal at the end of the season, and you have to like do the things day after day after day after day, and you have to manage, you know, the team psychology, the personalities, the coaches, the assistant coaches. All of that was very fascinating to me. So I love doing that, but yeah, that's kind of the PPE story.
Very interesting. And I mean, being at UPenn, I feel like any Ivy League school, there is a pretty big default path in terms of going down like finance or just a traditional either in academia going down some route or going down like a traditional career path that is like secure and high paying. Did you find other people at UPenn that were doing stuff in like the startup ecosystem or something independent? Because I guess the company that you had worked for out of college, Eco, was that the first gig that you had?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that not necessarily. When I was at Penn, I knew I didn't want to go into big finance. I just knew that was not me. It was not cut out for the Goldman route. Like, it's again same with the STEM thing. It's just no shade. It's just not me. And I did a lot of different jobs during summer. At that point, I was trying to go to the military. My dad's a Navy guy. His dad was in the Marine Corps. And, I mean, quite honestly, I grew up, and they were never, like, pushing me in that direction. But, I mean, the way I grew up was, like, you, like, owe something to, you know, being born in America. And, like, I felt like I owed something. And I still do in many senses. But it was a journey because I was going down that route. I was talking to recruiters, getting my package in, training. That was why I was rowing, right? Training hard. And at Penn, there's a lot of Navy guys who are doing their award and MBA, so they're accessible on campus. So I reached out to a bunch of them just cold. I was like, hey, I'm trying to do this thing. I'm training. Can we hop in the pool? Can we do this and that? And I had a guy who mentored me. And we would have very frank conversations just about like his life in the military and the good, the bad. And around the time when I was getting out of college was when the U.S. got out of Afghanistan, and that was like a very pivotal moment for me personally, kind of like watching all that happen. This was around 2020. COVID had happened. I was still in school technically, but I went home back to LA, and I got involved with some agency work with a friend of mine, my best friend from high school, who had started a TikTok marketing agency, growth agency at the time, and he was like, hey, like we need some help with copy, like we were in the same English class, and he was like, oh, you're good at writing. Like, do you want to just like help out and do some copy work? I was like, sure. Nothing to do during COVID. And we, did a lot of writing, and just that expanded into like growing his really, founder-led growth stuff, growing his, we were doing really growth hacky stuff, but like on Quora and LinkedIn, and just like making him a thought leader in that space because TikTok marketing was so new. No one really knew how to approach it, especially legacy brands. We were young, 2021. We're like, hey, we can do it. We did well, and we wound up getting acquired by a larger agency when we became seniors in college. So my senior year of college, I didn't even go back to Penn, right? There was no rowing season because it was COVID. They're like, we're going to cancel the season. We're not doing it. So I stayed in LA, and I was able to pass, fail my classes. which is wild in retrospect. But Penn was just like, you can pass for all your classes. I was like, okay. And I worked full time at that agency, so I was just doing brand strategy stuff and copywriting and literally, anything that was like pen to paper. I was going to touch, which was great because I got so much experience across multiple different verticals of like D2C, e-commerce, crypto, the whole range of clients that come through like a full service marketing, branding, design agency. And the way I found Eco was I was put on that project in that year. And I knew nothing. I had heard about Bitcoin, but I was like, I don't know anything about really crypto. They were just like, here's this client. We need this like brand strategy deck kind of turned around within, a couple of days. Can you do this? I was like, sure, I'll figure it out. And kind of went down that rabbit hole and met more and more people on the team. They had just raised a big round. And at that time, I was like, okay, I'm not going to the Navy. I don't really know what I'm doing. And I had developed a report and just done good work for them. And they're like, hey, you should apply for this editor position that we have. And I was like, okay. So I did. That's how I wound up there.
Wow. And even the company before Eco, that agency that you were working for and supporting, were they doing functionally the same type of work that like you are doing now with North End Creative? Or was that more geared to like social media content?
Yeah. There's Slope is the agency. They're still going to do fantastic work. They do a lot of branding stuff. And I don't know if they still do paid social, but at the time it was branding, some content marketing, not a ton, but a lot of paid social, some organic social I would help out with. But yeah, they've worked with a ton of different fantastic clients. So it was a great place to really just start learning how to operate, quite truthfully. And just really learn kind of on the fly. It's one thing to be good at writing and be good with words. It's another thing to figure out, okay, this is actually how you like construct a headline or like the tactical kind of implementations of those things. It was a great place to sharpen those skills. But all I have to say, I personally, at least right now, I'm not doing like branding overhauls. I'll do like brand strategy stuff and content and copywriting and stuff like that. But the actual brand designing work, I'd love to eventually down the line, but not yet.
And even the UPenn experience overall, in terms of like being a rower, knowing that you're not like a, let's say, STEM person and having the handful of interests that you had while at UPenn, I'm curious like how you reflect on that college experience, like pros, cons. I know obviously a lot of Stanford undergrads having been a Stanford student have heard mixed things about UPenn, some good, some not so good. So I'm curious about your experience.
No, Penn was great, man. My parents had gone there and they met there actually, so I knew about it. And Philly itself, I'm not gonna say that West Philly is like paradise. It's a little bit more of a rough and tumble neighborhood, kind of like USC out here. You kind of like imagine like that, but it was great. Like I was from California, I'm born and raised, and just seeing something new, going out, living on your own, the other side of the country, figuring out what you want to do. I mean, it's a formative experience. I think I'm glad if I hadn't left for school, I don't know if I would have left California. It's beautiful here. But yeah, I loved it. And I loved being a part of the team too. That was like a very formative experience. Arguably, I would say more so than the stuff I did in the classroom.
When I reflect on like even my college experience, academically it was great, but probably the most memorable would be spending 2 summers in Tokyo, Japan, and doing work there, and then also doing this exchange program where I had like lived in Santiago, Chile for a couple months. I know that on a couple of your summers while at UPenn, you had done some rather adventurous things. I'm curious, just go into a little detail about like what those were and like why you decided to spend your summers doing those things.
Yeah, good question. I was talking about that with a friend yesterday. I got to Penn. I had transferred from Rice. I went to Rice.
Oh, wow.
So I was in Texas for a year. I transferred after I had failed anatomy. Like, it's not for me. Like, Rice is very STEM, fantastic people, but I was like, so I wound up transferring to Penn. And Rice is a great school, by the way. I still have friends there who went there, graduated there, etc. But I got to Penn, and at that point, I was like, okay, I want to go to the Navy. I was still on that track, and I knew I wanted to row, so I walked on the rowing team. But over that kind of course of time in my life, I was like, okay, what other hard things can I do? That was kind of like my basic question of like, what kind of adventures can I have? What hard things can I do that would like force me to be out of my comfort zone? Because I think, I was fortunate enough to get a scholarship to go to like a private school in California that was like very great, very affluent. And my parents are, relatively middle class, but I realized kind of at that age of like, I could, you go from that school to Rise to Penn, and then you kind of go on. You could live most of your life like really never interacting with people who just are very, very different or from very different backgrounds. So I know I wanted to like pursue that as a way to just like grow as a young man. So all that to say, I was at Rice for that freshman year. I remember walking into the career fair there and seeing the line to Microsoft going all the way outside of the gym and like around, and I was just like, this doesn't seem like I don't think I should get in that line. Like this doesn't. It's like it was the herd mentality. And I'm not saying like Microsoft is great. Yep. Like they make a lot of money and it's like a great place to work. But for me, I was like, I don't want to do that. There has to be some other thing that's like not. Everyone's going to the career fair and like talking to these people and trying to chat them up and give them their resumes. And I'm like, I'm a freshman, dude. I'm like 18, 19. I don't have anything in my resume that someone's gonna be like, yeah, let's hire him. So I was like, what could I do? And I called one of my best friends from high school who was at Wharton undergrad, and we wound up at Penn together eventually. But I was like, dude, like, what are you doing this summer? Are you interning? Are you going home? Like, what's going on? And he was like, dude, honestly, I don't know. Like, I can't get jobs anywhere. We don't have really experience. And I was like, do you want to have like an adventure or do something? Because he's kind of that guy. He's like, yeah, dude, screw it. Like, he's that kind of friend. And he was like, yeah, I'm down. And I was like, dude, you remember the show Deadliest Catch on Discovery Channel? Like the old show, like that we would watch sometimes growing up. He was like, yeah. I was like, what if we did something like that? And he was like, honestly, I'm down, man. Like if you can figure it out, like I'm down. And I was like, okay. So the next couple months, I sort of just like educated myself on the ins and outs of commercial fishing in Alaska, which is a very complex industry apparently. Deadliest Catch is winter crabbing, and that's really freaking gnarly. That's gnarly. In the middle of the Bering between Russia and Alaska. I was like, okay, that's winter. Summer though is salmon fishing, which happens in the bay, Bristol Bay, and there's a couple river systems that people fish. So I was like, okay, we could totally do that. So I started. Honestly, it was a good like growth hacking experiment in retrospect. But I started joining Facebook groups where these captains would hang out. Like I just researched a bunch online. There's like Bristol Bay fishermen of Alaska, whatever. I would join the Facebook groups. I would PM the admin and be like, hey, I just joined this group. This is who I am. I'm in college. I'm, alcohol, drug free, like looking for work, whatever. Just send them a nice message and just do that repeatedly and post in the groups as well. Eventually, this guy saw my post, commented, and just a random guy, and was like, hey, here's my number. Like, give me a call. So I step out of class. I give him a call. I like patch Brandon into the call. We're talking to this dude from Facebook. And it turns out he was in California at the time. So that winter break, we went up to the Channel Islands because he was fishing squid. And we met him, had a meal, hung out. And he was like, you guys seem like good guys. Like, I want to try to help you get a job. I'm not going to Alaska this summer, but my old captain is, and he knows people, and he needs help himself. So that's eventually who I worked with, his old captain who was running a fishing boat up in Alaska, and he referred me. And I flew up there and did it for 4 months.
That's insane. And did you have, like, fishing experience beforehand, or was it always all just on the fly?
None, absolutely. I knew like mate, bow, stern, port, starboard, but that was it. Like I had no idea anything else. So I had to learn my knots, like the whole thing.
Like what did the average day look like? Was it pretty grueling of a process, or like I don't even know like where you start, but like I'm just curious to hear more about that day-to-day experience.
Yeah, it was our moms, because I got a job on that one boat, and the captain was like, "We're gonna hire you, cool. Your buddy." We can't have two greenhorns on the same boat, which like newbies or whatever is the terminology, because it would just be unsafe, right? Like I didn't really know what I was doing. If you have two people who don't know what they're doing,
just
like,
liability at that point.
Hurt, somebody else could get hurt. Yeah, total liability. So he's like, but actually I know another captain like in the fleet of boats that we're running that needs a deckhand, so your buddy can go on that boat. I was like, okay, not ideal because we want to be together, but like cool. We'll meet up after the season and like cool. So we flew up there to remote Alaska. We went LA to Anchorage, and we went Anchorage to like a small, tiny airport called King Salmon Airport. It's like a room. We got off the plane, put our stuff in the back of a pickup truck, and just hopped in the back and drove down to the harbor and hopped on the boat. And we're just like, okay, we're here. Like, what do we do? And we did everything from literally swabbing the deck, like cleaning the deck, as like you would imagine, to just like maintenance on the boat, whatever, the painting, like just manual labor, like a lot of just manual labor. But it was a good lesson. I remember like the first day, my captain was like, look, like I get it. You never been up here. And I don't know what worlds you come from prior, but when you're on this boat, like figure out how to make yourself an asset, not a liability in whatever you're doing. You cannot be a liability. Be an asset. If you don't know how to be an asset, ask, we'll help you, but figure it out. It's like, okay, cool. Which honestly, as I've gotten older, has been like a good lesson in terms of, you know, I think the same applies for startups and building things and stuff like that. But our day to day was that we were the middleman boat between the small fishing boats who were up the river and the cannery where all the fish gets processed. So we would go out to the river systems, we'd take on all the fish from these smaller boats into our big boat. We have cranes, and my job would be like to basically move these bags of fish over our holds, pull this cord, fish would go in the hold, we'd fill them all up, then we'd go back to the cannery, we'd offload, and then we'd just kind of run back and forth. So yeah, we were there for like doing that for like 3 to 4 months.
Amazing.
Just on the boat.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah.
You know, the point about just being in regular interaction with people that live lives completely like outside of what your day-to-day realm or universe really is, and just like to have conversations with them and to interact with them. That's like one really cool aspect.
Yeah.
The other is just like the regular process of having some sort of like a hobby or activity that you're just like incompetent in, and like starting from the bottom. It's like, especially I imagine as somebody who's like bright, a UPenn student, and like you becoming, you know, the lowest person on the totem pole. Like for me, I just recently started bouldering, and like climbing has been a really fun activity.
Nice.
And I thought like going in, because I have a gymnastics background, that I would have like quite a bit of an advantage and would able to become like pretty advanced relatively quickly. But it is like incredibly humbling because you see like these scrawny guys and they're like killing it. And then I go up there and I can't even grab like the first hold, you know? And to be like regularly reminded of just like the fact that you are a nobody in comparison to these other peoples in this domain, I think there's something super healthy about it, you know?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I remember one of the conversations I had with my captain, maybe a couple weeks in, and I was doing the dishes or something. He was like, "So do you like go to school?" And I was like, "Yeah, I go to school. I go to college." He was like, "Oh, where do you go?" And I was like, "Oh, I go to a school called UPenn, University of Pennsylvania, and I just transferred there." And he was like, "Oh, like is that a good school?" And I was in my head, my instinct is like, dude, I just grinded so hard to transfer into this school, and like all these different things that I did, like in my head, was my immediate reaction. But it was humbling because my next thought was like, dude, no one gives a shit about that up here. Like no one cares about your nice degree or like your nice thing, whatever you can point to. It's like, can you like tie your ropes? Are you like a good, or tie your knots? Are you a good guy? Are you safe? Do people trust you? Or all these different things that I think it was just like I was 18, 19. It was like a very humbling thing to be like, cool, like succeed, like you should, you know, go to a good school and work hard and all that kind of stuff. But there's people for whom that just never crosses their minds for like their whole life, and that's totally okay. And you should know how to interact with both in both environments.
And so did that first summer experience kind of inform your decision to do this other adventurous summer of like, was it like fighting wildfires? Was that basically what you were doing in California?
Yeah, so I finished up at Penn, and that was in Alaska, and that was in between Rice and Penn. So I transferred from Rice. It was like a week after I got my acceptance from Penn. I was up in Alaska, did that for a couple of months, and then I showed up to Penn in the fall, and walked on the team and was kind of doing my thing. And at that point, again, I was still like, I want to go to the Navy once I graduate. So what hard thing can I do this summer? And I was like, I could go back to Alaska, but I didn't really want to. I had done it, right? Alaska is beautiful, but that environment up there was like, honestly, it was rough after a couple of months. Like, it is dark in the sense of like, there is people go up there to run from things a lot of times. Like quite literally, like we had a guy that was taken off another boat, like the state troopers just pulled up and like took him off, and we're like, okay, well, he's gone. I don't know what happened. But like there's that type of thing, and then there's also just people you can tell like are not, you're like, I don't know what's going on with you, man, but like something's up. So I was like, I don't know if I want to do that again. But I was like, what can I do? So I was like, okay, I go to like a ranch in Montana. I was like, throwing stuff against the wall. And I remember being like, okay, well, I live in California. There's wildfires here all the time. I hear about people, crews that go fight these wildfires. It can't be that hard to get a job there, especially if I've had this. I could leverage that last experience. So I did a bunch of Googling and eventually found this form for this crew that was based in San Luis Obispo, which is like a 3-hour drive from LA. And I filled it out. and it was like an application form. I filled it out. I emailed the guy, the captain. I was like, hey man, like I just filled out this form, for the crew this summer. Just want to introduce myself and, whatever, and would love the opportunity and this and that. And I got an invite to go to training up in SLO and competed for a spot on the crew and was able to get a job. And I was there for 3 or 4 months doing that, which is great. That was such a good I'm going to one of my old crewmates. He's getting married in a couple months. I'm going to his wedding. So I still keep in touch. When I go to SLO, I stay with one of my old buddies there. That was very much so like a family, where you're like, everyone wants to be here. Everyone competed hard for these spots on the crew. There's only 20 of them. And everyone has since gone on to different crews. And there's one guy our crew alpha is now smoke jumping, which is like the most gnarly job you could do in fire. Like they're like SEAL Team 6 of firefighting. We were like, at that time, we were like infantry people, basically. But they're all just really, really good people. So I'm proud to have worked there, and for only a summer. I'm not going to, there's people who do that season in, season out, season in, season out. But to have just like a little taste of that was humbling, and also I was grateful to have it.
Yeah. It's interesting because even as I think about like how I'm trying to craft my life right now and where I should be prioritizing my time and energy, one of the things that I have been thinking about is how important it is to also have like a unique portfolio of experiences, because you see a lot of successful people that have like financial security and job security as well. And they're doing well for themselves by most of societal metrics. But I think the thing that like catches most people's eyes are like, what real like unique experiences have you had that other people haven't? And in terms of like scarcity, we talk about some of these guys that are coming out of undergrad, and a lot of them you can characterize them in a few words of like, studied econ, went to Goldman, went to private equity, and now I'm a vice president at this bank or that bank, right? And it's not to like degrade those paths by any means, but as I reflect on like my own life and think about like how do I want to be very intentional, so that 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, I have something that I can look back on and be like proud of. And I think that piece of it, and part of the reason why it's interesting to find people like you who are in some ways like betting on themselves and doing something independent, is because even in this process, like you are creating a unique experience for yourself that I imagine, regardless of whether it becomes wildly successful or it even fails, you'll be able to look back on in 10 to 20 years and be like, I remember that whole experience and that was meaningful.
Dude, absolutely. I totally agree with that. And I resonate with what you're saying. It's not to like, there's linear paths, right? In many ways, it's like a school like Stanford or a school like Penn. It's like you fight tooth and nail to get in. And then that serves as like the launching pad to be like, oh, X, firms will only recruit from like Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Princeton, Penn, whatever it is, right? You kind of fight to get there, and to choose experiences to fill your portfolio with that are very different. I think, for me, I knew it was the right thing for me. It might not be the right thing for everyone, but it was the right thing for me, like where I was as a young man in my life and like what I was seeking at the time, I think. And I'm glad to have done them. I feel grateful to have like stumbled. I mean, it was, I was on Facebook getting jobs in Alaska. It was like, some real kind of growth hacky stuff. But to your point about what I'm doing now, it's like, the one thing I knew before I left Eco was that like, the worst thing I can do is not take a risk. And I remember thinking like, what is like the brave thing to do in this situation? Like I could have stayed and like just continued on, and like it would have been great. It's great companies. We're gonna start up fast paced, whatever. But like I knew deep down like the brave thing to do would be like to launch something and like really go 120% all into it. And I think at least for me, I've always had things in my life where, like I know deep down what the brave thing to do is. And again, it's like I live a very comfortable life. I'm in California. Like I'm grateful. It's like I want to caveat that like brave is relative. But for me at that point, it was like, okay, I'm scared to do this. Like I don't know if I'm going to succeed or fail. I've always been in environments that are kind of like you work, and then get the external validation of the acceptance and depend, or like, whatever thing it is. It's like, I don't know how this is going to shake out. I don't know if I can do it. But the brave thing to do is to try. So, Yeah, I totally resonate with what you're saying.
When you said you were like searching for jobs via Facebook, or at least opportunities, right, to like how to spend your summers, but then you had said like, I guess it was maybe 5 or 6 months ago we connected, it might have been less than that, on Twitter, and I was like one of the early people that you had connected with.
Yeah.
I'm curious about your like social media presence, like what you have found to be valuable, surprising, things like that. You had shared that little notebook of just like posting consistently, and you know, sure, you can look at it and be like, yeah, this is kind of a dumb thing to do, but I think there's something very valuable in like earning trust with somebody each day consistently over time. It goes a long way. So just in terms of like social media and what you've learned from using it, both like the good and the bad, I'm curious about how that journey has also like affected your like lead generation and opportunities and all that stuff.
Oh, I would not have like a functional business if I wasn't on Twitter, which is like kind of cliche to say, but and that's I started writing before posting more and writing things online before I left Eco, because I knew, I was like, if I go out on my own, you need to start talking about what you're doing. Like I need to take my own medicine. If I'm going to be selling content services and content production and writing to people, it's like I got to be actively doing the same thing, iterating, seeing what works, and I can speak to that, right, in client calls and whatnot. So tactically, it's like it's a high leverage thing. I think on a different level, and you know why we're here, is that like when you start putting things out into the world, you do become a magnet for people who either see things similarly, or like similarly with like maybe a nuance or a different take, or even people who disagree with you and are like, hey, I actually think this, but it's still a dialogue. And I have loved, one of the things I worried was that I felt, you know, over the last kind of year of career, I felt a little stagnant. I'm like, I'm not meeting people, right? I'm not like, you know, I'm work remote, right? And I loved my teammates and it was great, but I didn't feel like I was like moving the ball forward of like, oh, I'm meeting new, interesting people doing different things, and that leads to this and this leads to that. And writing online has been like the single biggest thing that has led me to like tons of just in-person meetings and Zooms and like friends that now we text, and like real friends like who are like, oh, I'm genuinely invested in your success, and like vice versa. And I think that has been like an incredibly motivating thing. And also, you know, you get to know people, and like people, especially when you're starting a business, it's like you go through the same, you know, like the same like emotional pendulum swings of like, oh my God, we can totally win. Oh my God, it's all over. You know, the truth is somewhere in the middle, right? And how do you keep yourself sort of like level through that is like really by having people that you can be honest with and be like, there's no shame, no like posturing of like, I have it all figured out. It's like, no, I don't have it all figured out. I have like some hypotheses on things and maybe some good ideas, but those can always be better and be refined. And the more you say what is true, I was telling this to a friend earlier today, like, writing online has been like, I'm gonna say and write what I truly believe, right? Like, you know, if people resonate with that, great. If like they don't. But either way, it helps me refine my beliefs, because your beliefs are not static, and it just attracts people who have something to say about what you think as well. So I avoided writing online for a long time just because I was very scared, right? Like honestly, just very nervous. You know, what are people going to think of me? I might sound dumb, you know. But I think once I kind of got over that threshold, really by necessity, I was like, well, there's no other way to go about this. I have to. And shouting into the void for a while. You know, you get one comment or like, you know, one person like, oh, they liked your thing or they retweeted your thing. And that kind of keeps you going, as I'm sure you know, as you've been posting and doing this, you know, you're doing the same thing with content and podcasts and all that stuff. So yeah, TLDR, I would not have like a functioning business, or like a lot of the referrals and just lead gen and just friends, honestly, friends more than anything. So yeah,
it's pretty wild. Like I'm only 15 plus episodes into like the podcast and all of that stuff at this point. But most of probably like 80 to 90% of the people that I've had on are me just like cold DMing people saying, hey, the work you're working on looks interesting. I think I could have a fun conversation with you. Would you be willing to join? And the hit rate is like 70 to 80%. Now, I often come with some context as to like, here's why I want to talk to you. Here's what I've done. Here are some prior episodes that I produced. So it's not like, you know, I'm just saying, hey, come on my podcast. There's more to it. But I think there is something to be said about somebody who just wants to create opportunities for themselves. Like they would more than likely be surprised by how willing people are to help if you're just like actively engaging. And that's one thing that gives me, I guess, like hope in terms of like the future of this podcast and doing something like potentially independent. Is it does seem like there are people that are willing to like support in pretty meaningful ways if you're willing to make the effort. So I've only learned this in the past like 4 or 5 months, kind of same boat as you, but it is pretty remarkable to just see that kind of, you know, sentiment and atmosphere.
Oh yeah, dude. And people come out of the woodwork, like people who are like, oh, I didn't even out of nowhere, and you're like a guy I was talking with on Twitter last night who like he liked a couple of my tweets and like we followed each other and was like, he had like a funny handle and I was like, dude, this handle's hilarious, like well done. And then we just started chatting. He's like gonna be out in El Segundo apparently doing an internship this summer. He's like still in school. I was like, dude, when you come out, let's hit me up, let's get coffee, whatever, stuff like that. People are, especially in the remote work culture, it's like people want that and they really feel a need for it. So
I think that it's probably just a healthier way to do social media is if you find an account that looks interesting to at least like have a conversation with them, even if it's like a remote conversation, because at least what I found is as soon as you establish that like personal connection, your willingness to like engage and interact with the content that they post is like 10 times higher than if it's just an account that you see that's interesting and it's just a picture on a screen that you see across your Twitter feed every once in a while. As soon as you have like that personal connection, it's a lot easier to, I guess, like just like be a part of their journey.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And just like adding value without, like I wrote about this actually the other week, but like expecting nothing in return. It's like I think if you're doing cool things, I'm gonna retweet it and like say like, hey, follow this guy, or like he's doing some cool things, with like no expectation of like you do the same. It's just like when people sense that you want them to win with no strings attached, that's like very powerful.
Yeah.
It's like huge because it's rare. Like people are like, oh, you're selling to me. You're like, what? It's like, no, dude, I think what you're doing is cool. And like, however I can help you, great. If that means we work together, great. If that means you're a client, great. If that means not, and we're just like always friends for the next couple of years, great. But when people can sense that energy from you, which really, it sounds vague, but it is really energy and how you come across. The funny thing is, a lot of times that turns into business down the line. So, yeah.
100%. I'm curious in terms of like how you are providing some structure around your days, like the weekdays, and like you could be like reading, you could be writing, you could be trying to have more conversations with people. Like in terms of the time allocation from when you first jumped into doing this like full time to now being a little over like 2 months, I guess you're 3 months in at this point. Like how have you thought through that? Are you still figuring it out to some extent?
Dude, yeah, I'm still figuring it out. I was talking to a friend about this who was over early this morning actually about it. You constantly feel like everything is on fire or your to-do list just never gets done. And you can either, for the first month or so, I was like, kind of became a little bit of a stress ball because of it. And I was like, damn, I didn't get through what I wanted to do today. And you feel like you failed or you feel like I'm not working hard enough, right? When the reality is you're working really freaking hard. And I think it tactically, I've done a lot of reading just about how to build a business and talk to friends and who have done it in the past. You got to keep your current clients not just happy, but like delighted with like what you're offering them and go above and beyond, especially early days, like over deliver value at even a lower price point, because that turns into upselling or it turns into referrals or it turns into whatever. So like make sure they are not just happy, but like delighted to be working with you. So that's kind of been my operationally like my North Star. It's like if I have a choice between like, working with, doing something extra for the client I have now and or like some lead generation stuff, normally the former will win out. All that to say, like you can't neglect lead gen and looking down the line and being like, okay, I want to have, X amount of deals in the pipeline or like having active conversations. Those are they can be harder to measure because it's not like I'm running like paid ads for my product or service. A lot of this is like chatting people on Twitter or chatting people on LinkedIn. Be like, hey, this is something cool. Maybe we could work together in the future, stuff like that. So it can be hard to quantify, and you kind of can walk away after a couple of hours of like messaging people and whatever, being like, well, did it actually do anything, right? Like no new money hit my bank account, right? But you have to remember that it's like those things are long-term games with long-term people, and like finding who those people are and just being friends with them. Inevitably leads to things down the line. That's happened to me a couple different times where I've just become friends with someone, they're building something cool, I'm trying to build something cool, And eventually they're like, hey, like I actually have this thing I thought we could collab together on. There was an example was a guy I cold messaged on Twitter. And he runs like a design studio, which is really cool. I have a great portfolio of work, and I found him, on like the Twitter recommended, followed him, shot him a message, kind of before I had the chance to talk myself out of it, and we wound up getting on a Zoom, and I could tell when we got on the Zoom, he was kind of like, "Why are we here?" Like kind of like,
Yep.
not why are we here, but like, why are we here? And but after I just learned more about what he was doing, and I framed it as like, I'm trying to build this thing. You have this great portfolio. I would love to just like download part of your brain for 20 minutes. Like if I could just steal 20 minutes of your time, I would love it. And people are amenable to that. So we chatted, and it was great. And by the end, he was like, "Oh, you worked at Eco?" Like we talked about the website. He was like, "Oh, cool." He had heard about it, and send him a follow-up email, and we've gone back and forth, and I might have like a deal that closes with him soon, just because he's like, "Oh, I thought of you because we have this project that we need some content help on." So being okay with like a longer sales cycle in the early days, and just keeping current customers delighted.
That's awesome. Yeah. It's funny because even with podcasting, I feel like there's some people that approach it differently. And so if you have somebody on a guest who's like not comfortable being completely transparent or just being like authentic, they feel like they need to put on a bit of a show for the recording. It's always like an awkward dynamic. But inevitably, if you go long enough, 15, 20, 30 minutes in, usually you'll get to a point where like the ice breaks and it's just like two people having a casual conversation like we are right now. And I think the same thing happens in the business world as well. And it sounds like as soon as you can like establish that relationship, everything changes. In terms of the writing that you're doing online, you started a series, Burn the Boats, highlighting like specific founders. Can you just say a little bit about like why you decided to start that? Have enjoyed reading some of those stories, so I'm just curious.
Oh, thanks, man. I appreciate that. Honestly, it started as a way to network with people who I thought were doing very cool things, and the North Star was like providing value, expect nothing in return, especially in the early days. And I also had seen the need of like there's founders who are building really hard things, and they have 10,000 different things on their plate at one time. They don't have the time to like write a detailed piece on like their own story and their why and weave that into the. So it's like, okay, I'll just talk to you for 30 minutes, and I can do that, right? Because I can take the recording, chop it up, move the Lego pieces around narrative-wise. And it's been great. I mean, I've had, people reach back out and been like, hey, man, like that led to some inbound for sales or like from, people interested in like what I'm building, investor-wise and stuff like that. And that makes me happy because like that's why I want to do that, right? You just want to provide value to people, not necessarily because they'll become clients, but just you want to support their work. And we're all out here trying to make it. So if I could do that, like with my skill set, it'd be great. I've loved doing that. It's been hard to keep pace on like one a week, honestly. I fell off for a little bit. I was sick and traveling, but that's my goal, is to do at least one a week.
Well, it's a really smart concept because you are also getting practice, like getting reps in of like telling these people stories.
Yeah.
And you also get to like demonstrate to some extent like your abilities and like get your name out there in the process of like providing value. So, I mean, I love people that just like create positive sum opportunities for themselves, and this seems like a very clear example of that. And I think the whole me podcasting as well, two people having a conversation that likely I would have enjoyed having anyways, but being able to like unlock that for other people in my network is super cool. So I love the idea. In terms of from a strategic lens, I'm curious just because do these startups, when they are thinking about like go-to-market strategies or telling their story, is there a pretty saturated market when it comes to like agencies doing or providing the service that you provide? I'm just curious from like a point of differentiation standpoint, how competitive that landscape is and how you're thinking through that.
Yeah, it's a good question, and something that I'm actively figuring out. Right, there's a lot of people who will be in your Twitter inboxes and be like, "Hey, we can write like X, tweets for you or like whatever, blow you up on LinkedIn." Yep. So I think, in terms of like moat, which is kind of the question of what I'm thinking that what we're talking about is like there is a moat to just be like being friends with as many people as possible because people will think of you, right? Content production it's not rocket science. right? Like there's certain principles and techniques and stuff that you probably know, through your marketing advertising sprint. And some people are just naturally better at it than others, but it is not rocket science. So you want to think about, okay, the product is, you can do the product, but then your distribution, how are you finding the people that you want to work with? And then how are you niching down, and in what way, shape, or form are you niching down? So I was having a conversation earlier with a friend about, product thinking, right? If you build for everybody, you're going to build for no one in many senses. Yep. The product or service that I'm offering is, my dad is a solopreneur lawyer. He could use, content marketing services just as much as a venture-backed B2B crypto SaaS startup would, maybe in different ways, but I could still, they would both be clients. The question is, who do you want to work with? Who's underserved? How does your particular skill set and how you approach narrative map onto, whether it's SMBs, whether it's venture-backed startups, et cetera? And then how can you de-risk who you're working with, right? Like the reality of the fact is that when you're working with venture-backed startups, say you're seed stage, if you don't get to Series A, the first person that's going to be cut is the contractor or the agency or the studio that you're working with. But on the flip side of that, a lot of venture-backed companies really can sometimes understand the power of narrative more so than maybe your average SMB. So there's a constant juggling, and it's explorative process, right? But I think 2, 3, 4, or 5 months in, my operating mental model has been obviously go through network, word of mouth referrals, deliver as much value online for people publicly that you can point to a body of work that people are like, well, what have you written? Oh, well, this, and this. And don't get too caught up in niching down, but always have them in the back of your mind of who do I like to work with? What things are resonating? How can I package different offerings in different ways that people get? So there is a bit of an art to it and a science to it. And finding mentors. I have a lot of great, my old managers, friends who have scaled service businesses and be like, hey, how would you do this? Right. And I think that has been, that's kind of, sometimes it's hard because you don't want to be I don't have it all figured out. You're yeah, I'm crushing it after 3 months. And it's okay, I'm doing fine. I'm surviving and, but I'm not rolling in dough. I still have a lot of things that I need to figure out. So being open about those things with people and even with clients too, I think is people might disagree, but if this is the first time I'm doing something and a client is hey, can you do this thing? I'll be honestly, this is the first time I'm doing this, but this is how I would approach it. And this is how I would do it. And I just want to be transparent. Right. And then you go and do whatever it takes to go crush the work. Again, it's not necessarily rocket science. But level setting and being very transparent, it is always, I think, if you're playing long-term game, that's always the right thing to do. So
Matt, it was, I'm really glad that we were able to meet over Twitter a few months ago and that we could have this conversation. It is, I think, it is a very different type of conversation when you have discussions with people around what they're actively working on and trying to make make their dreams come true versus people talking about it in hindsight. It's just it's hard to remember in real time what those experiences were like. So I'm super excited for all that you're working on. I realize you're only 2.5 months in at this point, but will be fun to have another conversation at some point in the future. In terms of your work, ways that people can find you, if there are other founders, entrepreneurs listening that are interested in these types of services, what is the best way for them to reach out?
Yeah, Twitter. I'm probably too active on Twitter now. My girlfriend's I'm gonna take your phone and freaking chuck it in the river if you tweet again. Are you tweeting? She's this is your tweeting position, not your texting position. But no, Twitter definitely is where I try to connect with people. Twitter and LinkedIn. But yeah, and even if someone listens to this and it's they're not in the market, but just oh, I want to chat. I worked in Alaska or something random. I love meeting new people and just talking about cool things. So I appreciate you having me on, man. This is I really appreciate the opportunity and how that we met and just becoming friends. And I'm excited for this podcast and how it grows and what you wind up doing in the future. So.
Appreciate it, Matt. We'll drop the links to your Twitter, your LinkedIn, all that good stuff in the show notes. And,
cool.
and thanks for joining.